In October 1542, ships commanded by Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed between Anacapa Island and the coastline of modern-day Ventura County. The first Europeans to visit the area, they were followed in the early 18th century by Cabrera Bueno, and it was he who recorded the promontory on his maps as Punta de la Conversión. To the Chumash Indians who inhabited the region, however, it was known as Huaynimi, a word that in their native tongue meant a resting place. The Spanish colonists kept the name for the settlement using their pronunciation of the Chumash word. In 1857, the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey charted what Bueno had named Point Conversion as Point Huaynimi, thus eradicating the name that had appeared on the original Spanish navigational charts. By the time pioneer Thomas Bard arrived from Pennsylvania in 1865, the area was changing from a sleepy hamlet sprawled around the mission of San Buenaventura to a busy farming community. Soil from which had sprung in Spanish colonial times only vegetables and vines, produced now an abundant crop of barley. Land that had before felt nothing but the hooves of mustangs felt now the plows of new settlers, intent on farming for profit rather than subsistence. Bard and others who shared his long-term view of business could see that the Ventura area in general, and Port Huaynimi in particular, held great promise. In 1869, the town of Huaynama, the spelling now anglicized, came into being under the leadership of W.E. Barnard, a prominent citizen who would become its first postmaster. However, in 1872, when the town was formally laid out by Thomas Bard, the original spelling of the name was used. Bard set about the tasks allotted him by his employer, Pennsylvanian financier Thomas Scott. He drilled for and discovered oil in Ojai, then turned his attention to the development of a wharf at Huaynimi. Despite strong and at times violent opposition, now referred to by historians as the Huaynimi War, he succeeded in giving the city its own wharf. On the beach where the natural features of the ocean bed allowed the berthing of large vessels, a robust pier of treated lumber, more than 900 feet long, was built out into the deep water. At a stroke, the Huaynimi Wharf made trade a simple and convenient matter. Cargo that had previously been rowed through the surf at the cost of great effort by lightermen now glided effortlessly along rails under the influence of gravity alone into a nearby warehouse. Henceforth, the fruits of the area's perpetual harvest could be efficiently transported to the markets that would pay most for them. The importance of Bard's achievement cannot be overestimated. It guaranteed the commercial success of the region for many years to come and made Huaynimi one of the largest grain shipping ports on the Pacific coast. To make navigation safer for the many vessels using the wharf, a lighthouse was erected in 1874. In town, fine homes were built by the newly affluent. Stores, a hotel, and a school were also erected to serve the swelling population. These were the happiest days for the people of Huaynimi. In May of 1891, the Free Press newspaper reported, "The wharves and warehouses filled with the products of the country are a wonder to the casual visitor. It is all a scene of active life and enterprising industry." The happiness of Hueneme citizens would, however, prove short-lived. In 1897, Henry T. Oxnard opened his sugar factory on land that would form the nucleus of the city that bears his name today. The Southern Pacific Railroad pushed its tracks across the Santa Clara River for the first time to service this substantial enterprise, one of the largest in the world, it was said. Oxnard's joy became Hueneme's sorrow. The new city of Oxnard drew much of the talent it required for growth from the surrounding area, particularly Hueneme. Lamenting the loss of one of its most popular medical men, the Hueneme Herald commented, "Oxnard wants him, and what Oxnard wants, she usually gets." One by one, business and professional people left Hueneme for Oxnard. The final blow to the city's prospects would come from the Southern Pacific Railroad. The completion of the Santa Susana Tunnel, linking San Francisco and Los Angeles via the town of Oxnard, made Hueneme Wharf less practical for producers shipping to the east than the railroad. For a time at least, the sun set on the city that scant years earlier had held so much promise. Hueneme took on the appearance of a ghost town. Over the next 20 years, various attempts were made to revive the town's fortunes. An account by the Los Angeles Examiner that to rival its namesake in Florida, California is to have its Ormond Beach, proved to be overly optimistic. The development plan for the Hueneme Beach came to nothing. In April 1906, the Free Press trumpeted, "The railroad is coming." Due to legal difficulties, it never did. The new streetcar and local rail services linked the city with Oxnard, but did little to improve its fortunes. The opening of the Panama Canal in 1911 generated enough optimism for the wharf to be extended to 1,700 feet. The increase in trade, however, was not sustained. Ventura County's once busy port slumbered on, the hopes of its residents kept alive by proposals that came to nothing. These ranged from the establishment of a tomato cannery to the sale in 1926 of residential lots. The latter enterprise was finally terminated by the stock market collapse of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed. A long-term local resident commented, "Hueneme sleeps. Now and then the town stirs in its lethargy with the report of a coming boom and then goes quietly back to its long rest. Its boom day has passed, and all that remains is the relics of the past, old rickety frame structures and tottering buildings." But as the city slumbered, the seeds of its recovery were already germinating. They sprouted in the form of an industry based on a new crop, citrus fruit. Lima beans and sugar beets were a thing of the past. Lemons were what mattered now. To prove it, the Sun-Kissed Company built 2 large packing plants in Hueneme and became one of the city's largest employers. Hueneme was viable again, but by no means prosperous. The populace dreamed still of a great harbor for their city, a modern version of their once most worthwhile asset, the Hueneme Wharf, the enterprise that won for their grandfathers such fortune and fame. A resident remembered that at this time, there were 4 or 5 stores in Hueneme and a bank, hotel, and restaurant, a post office, drugstore, library, and 2 streetlights. The one common desire was to build a harbor in the salt flats west of town. They would in time have their harbor, but the process would be a difficult one. Rivalries, civic and personal, financing difficulties, and petty jealousies were manifold. The movement, however, was irresistible. Even a statement by President Roosevelt that the project was economically unsound did nothing to deter the harbor's proponents. The combination of talent, effort, and at times sheer willpower would eventually overcome all difficulties. 13 years after the request for a feasibility study was granted, construction began. On February 4th, 1934, Richard Bard, the son of the man who created the Hueneme Wharf 68 years before, turned the first shovel of soil to start the new project. The importance of this new harbor to the city and the transformation that would take place in its fortunes can scarce be understood at this distance in time. In 1935, Hueneme was described by the Pasadena Evening Star as a little town about 60 miles up the north coast, set down in a quiet spot that seems to have no excuse for a town. The name is an Indian name for rest, and certainly rest and quiet are what you get the most of in Hueneme. By 1940, the newspapers declared with enthusiasm and confidence, Port Hueneme is the answer to the dreams of industrialists who would like to move to Southern California, where utilities and climate make production easiest and cheapest in the nation. The opening of the harbor on July 6, 1940 was a grand affair. Bands played and marched. The finest horses, skillfully ridden by costumed riders, pranced proudly before the crowds gathered for the momentous occasion. A blimp was in attendance. Parachutists thrilled the assembled throng. In the warmth of the summer evening, a fireworks display filled the air with the smell of gunpowder and drew dazzling reflections upon the water beneath. Everyone enjoyed the occasion they believed marked for all the world to see the beginning of their city's renaissance. That evening, the rich man to his mansion and the poor man to his humble abode turned homeward with an equal measure of joy and satisfaction in their hearts. The attack on Pearl Harbor, made so reluctantly by its architect, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, changed the direction of world affairs in a few brief moments. It did as he anticipated it would, take the sleeping American giant and goad him into action. The west coast of America became an ant's nest of activity. An attack by a Japanese submarine on Goleta that resulted in minor property damage prompted talk of an enemy invasion. Fear of sabotage caused tens of thousands of Californians of Japanese ancestry to be transported to internment camps in the Owens Valley. In 1942, the U.S. Navy took over the harbor and started a massive building program. Port Hueneme would, as a result, become the second busiest wartime harbor on the West Coast, handling in 1945 over 3 million tons of supplies for the war effort. The city's population grew massively, and in the frenzy of the war effort, the impact on its delicate coastal environment was overlooked. The social problems of a port town, largely populated by young men, also manifested themselves. The county sheriff's department was kept busy. Both issues would create an unfortunate and unforeseen legacy for the future. At the end of the war, the transition to a peacetime economy was not immediate. Large numbers of men and huge amounts of materiel needed to be returned to the United States, keeping the port busier at times than during the war itself. Even the sale of war surplus required great organizational effort and an army of clerks to accomplish. Finally, in the aftermath of this most tragic war, the people of Port Hueneme woke up to the consequences of living on the edge of a vast military installation. Port Hueneme had never been designed to support the size of population the war had thrust upon it. Flooding, beach erosion, fresh water shortages, and sewage disposal problems frustrated local officials. The reluctance of the Navy to allow them part of their own harbor for commerce was especially vexing. Despite strenuous efforts, they could find no one willing to assist them or take responsibility for the ongoing deterioration of their infrastructure. In the hope of becoming masters of their own destiny and to stave off an attempt at annexation by neighboring Oxnard, the movement for incorporation began. The campaign was bitter and divisive and led to much bad feeling locally. In March 1947, when the votes were counted, the motion had lost by a narrow majority. However, a year later, and with the prospect of the city being able to use part of its harbor once more, the tide turned. On March 16, 1948, the vote went strongly for incorporation. The new city of Port Hueneme faced many problems. At a time when it needed money most to deal with its mounting problems, the population and therefore tax revenues were declining. Improvement was desired by all, yet taxes designed to pay for it were stridently opposed. The years that followed incorporation were difficult, but productive. The city created its own police department. Dredging to prevent further beach erosion began. The ongoing sewage problem that caused the Port Hueneme beach to be quarantined in 1953 was solved in 1956 by the opening of the new sewer outflow. That same year, another major difficulty for the city was overcome when 1.5 million gallons of water per day began to flow through the pipeline from El Rio to Port Hueneme. The growth of the city continued. Local officials turned their attention to the unattractive downtown area, a legacy of the city's wartime era. Card clubs were closed at the formal request of the electorate in December 1961. Rigorous enforcement by local police rid the streets of undesirable elements, making them, according to Police Chief Al Gelati, safe and pleasant for man, woman, and child. The aesthetic as well as the economic and law enforcement needs of residents were being met by city administrators. On land donated by Richard Bard, a park was constructed, followed soon by a new library. The information that a small boat harbor would be built cheered local residents greatly. At a stroke, this would end their erosion problem, and a new source of local income would be created. Citizens banded together in order to improve their increasingly elegant community. The beach, once the city's greatest liability, was fast becoming its greatest asset. beautiful homes were being constructed. Money and people flowed into the area. The adoption of a long-term development plan created confidence in potential investors and residents alike. By the time of the death of Richard Bard in 1969, the mold from which the new city of Port Hueneme would be cast had been fully and most perfectly formed. And what a city it would become. A place where ships laden with produce for Japan would pass incoming vessels filled to capacity with cars from England and Germany. Where in the waters first navigated by Spanish explorers in fragile wooden ships, supercarriers would ply their trade. 50 years after incorporation and more than a century since its birth, the city of Port Hueneme remains, in many respects, as idyllic as the day it was founded. Named by Native Americans for its serenity, it offers today's residents much of what they enjoyed so long ago. The warmth of a gentle sun, the coolness of ocean breezes, the beauty of a pristine sandy beach washed by the crystal-tipped waves of the Pacific Ocean. A place of commerce? Undoubtedly. A place of great natural beauty? Assuredly. A place of rest since time immemorial. A place called Port Hueneme.